I woke up with a heavy, unsettling feeling in my chest, as if the very air around me was conspiring to remind me of how far I had drifted from the life I thought I'd built. The morning light filtered softly through the bedroom curtains, landing on the edge of the framed wedding photo that Emily had insisted we keep on the nightstand. Its silent presence felt like mockery. Emily stirred beside me, her back turned. I watched her for a moment, her breathing steady but shallow. For years, I'd cherished these quiet moments, seeing her like this, peaceful, unguarded, completely mine. But today, the sight of her only made the ache in my chest worse. Something was off. It had been for a while. I slid the covers back and moved quietly to the bathroom. Standing at the sink, I brushed my teeth and stared at my reflection. The lines on my face were deeper than I remembered, and the gray creeping into my temples was more noticeable than ever. I had always blamed it on long hours at work, on the constant push to create a stable life for us. But now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was something more, something missing. Lately, work had become my escape. My projects, the endless stream of numbers, even back-to-back meetings with clients, they all felt lighter compared to the weight of coming home to Emily's cold smiles and distant silence. It hadn't always been like this. We used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. Somewhere along the way, though, that connection had unraveled. When I walked back into the bedroom, Emily was awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at her hands. Her gaze flicked to me briefly, guarded. "Morning," she said, her voice flat. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. She didn't return it. Instead, she stood abruptly and walked toward the closet. I noticed the subtle stiffness in her shoulders, the way she avoided making eye contact. It wasn't anger. No, this was worse, it was indifference. I glanced across the room at my desk, where a haphazard pile of bills and reports sat waiting. Something caught my eye, a piece of paper peeking out from under a folder. Curiosity gnawed at me. As Emily disappeared into the bathroom, I crossed the room and picked it up. A receipt. My breath hitched as I read it. It was for a high-end escort service. The date stamped on it was recent, just last week. My thoughts raced. It couldn't be hers. Maybe it had been misplaced, something from a client or an event I wasn't remembering. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Emily's growing distance, her cool demeanor, the late nights she claimed were spent with friends, it all fell into place with an awful clarity. This receipt wasn't mine. It was hers. When she came back into the room, brushing her hair absent-mindedly, I quickly slid the receipt back under the folder and watched her carefully. There was something different about her, a lightness I hadn't seen in years. But I knew, it wasn't because of me. She caught my gaze in the mirror. "What?" she asked, her tone sharper than it needed to be. "Nothing," I said, glancing away quickly. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. As she grabbed her things and left the room, I sank heavily onto the edge of the bed. The receipt was a storm brewing in my thoughts, burning a hole in my mind. My chest ached, not just with betrayal, but with the sinking certainty that I had already lost her. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, sitting at my desk and sorting through emails that now felt trivial compared to the turmoil in my head. The memory of Emily's distant expression lingered in my mind, cutting deeper than any argument ever could. Her coldness wasn't loud, it didn't shout or slam doors, but it had a way of hollowing me out from the inside. Hoping to ground myself in something familiar, I reached for my calendar. Flipping through its pages, I noticed a set of dates circled in red, accompanied by shorthand notes. My stomach knotted as the realization hit me, these were weekends I'd been out of town for work. I had always assumed Emily spent those weekends catching up with friends or indulging in her hobbies. Now, those dates felt like puzzle pieces falling into place, revealing a much darker picture. I snapped the calendar shut and leaned back in my chair, my mind drifting to simpler times, times when Emily and I had been happy. Our honeymoon surfaced in my thoughts. We had chosen a quaint little beach town, nothing extravagant, just the two of us and the endless ocean. I could still see her, laughing as waves crashed against her legs, her sun-kissed face framed by damp hair. She was radiant, full of life, and in that moment, I'd felt invincible just being by her side. We spent hours walking along the shore, weaving dreams of the future. She had asked me about my ambitions, and I'd eagerly told her about my plans to build a business, a life where money wouldn't be something we'd ever have to worry about. Emily had smiled at me then, her eyes full of hope. "Just promise me you'll never get so caught up in work that you forget about us," she had said. I'd made that promise, but somewhere along the way, I had broken it. The sound of a door closing pulled me back to the present. Emily was home earlier than expected. I stayed in my office, listening to the soft rhythm of her footsteps. Then her voice broke the silence, and my whole body tensed. "Yes, I'm here now," she said, her tone low but purposeful. I moved closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. "I'll talk to him soon," she continued, her words deliberate. "But it has to be the right time. You understand that, right?" There was a pause before her voice softened further. "Matt, I know. I need to figure out how to do this. He's not a bad man." At the mention of his name, Matt, my chest tightened as though an invisible hand was squeezing the air out of me. It wasn't just a name, it was confirmation of what I had feared all along. My heart sank, but I stayed rooted to the spot, staring blankly at the wall. I should have confronted her right then, demanded the truth. But something held me back, pride, fear, or maybe some faint hope that I was wrong. Instead, my thoughts wandered to her mother, Mary, who had always been a source of steady advice in Emily's life. I remembered one of her parting comments to me during a family gathering: "Jake, stability is a rare gift. Don't let rough times convince you it's not worth fighting for." I wondered if Emily had spoken to her mother recently. Mary had always been practical, reminding Emily of the importance of what we had built together. But deep down, I doubted even Mary's voice could change the course Emily seemed to have set for herself. The house fell silent again as Emily moved to another room. I found myself staring at the calendar once more, the circled dates glaring at me like fresh wounds on a page. I didn't know exactly what Matt was offering her, but I could guess: freedom, excitement, a life without me. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder, had I been so caught up in my work that I allowed her to drift away? Or had she simply stopped seeing me for who I really was? The dynamic between us had shifted. Emily's movements seemed more calculated, her focus sharper, like she was rehearsing for a play where I was the clueless audience. I didn't let her know I'd noticed. Instead, I matched her calm demeanor, even her indifference, as though we were locked in a game of strategy where flinching meant defeat. I woke up early the next morning, pretending to be engrossed in my usual routine. Emily left the house, claiming she was meeting a friend for brunch. Her purse hung casually over her shoulder, but there was a faint trace of unease in her tone that she couldn't quite mask. I watched through the window as she drove away, the sinking feeling in my stomach solidifying what I already knew: Emily wasn't going to brunch with a friend. As the hours dragged on, I wandered aimlessly around the house, piecing together what little I knew. The circled dates in my calendar loomed in my mind, their meaning now painfully clear. They didn't mark my absence, they marked her opportunities. They were moments when I wasn't around to see who she had become. I eventually found myself in the kitchen, staring blankly at the granite countertop. The memory of the receipt resurfaced like a thorn lodged deep in my chest. It was from an escort service. I should have confronted her the moment I found it, demanded answers right then and there. But I knew Emily too well. She would lie. Worse, she would twist things around, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong. Instead, I resolved to wait, to gather my own proof before I made a move. The day passed in heavy silence, dragging on until Emily finally returned home. Something about her felt off. There was a flicker of anxiety in her eyes that she poorly disguised with an overly cheerful greeting. "How was brunch?" I asked, keeping my tone casual as I pretended to be absorbed in the newspaper. "It was nice. We just caught up on life," she replied, her voice unnaturally light, her words sounding rehearsed. I nodded, letting the conversation fade. That evening, she went to bed early, claiming she had a headache. I waited until I was sure she was asleep before slipping into my office. Quietly, I opened the desk drawer where I kept my personal files and began sorting through them. It was a calculated move, leaving certain things easy to access, knowing Emily's curiosity would get the better of her. Sure enough, I spotted the subtle evidence of her intrusion. Papers were slightly out of order, and there was a faint trace of her perfume lingering in places it didn't belong. A grim smile tugged at my lips. Emily was looking for something. Maybe she thought I was hiding money, or perhaps she wanted to gauge how difficult a divorce would be. Either way, it was confirmation of what I already suspected: her plans were well underway. Her words from that phone call echoed in my mind: "He's not a bad man." The sentiment festered, twisting into something sharp and bitter. She knew I didn't deserve this, yet here we were, two people locked in a silent game of strategy, each unwilling to admit that the other already knew the truth. Over the next week, Emily grew even colder. She moved through the house like a guest, avoiding my gaze and keeping her phone glued to her side. I pretended not to notice, feigning preoccupation with work. I even started leaving the house at odd hours, giving her the space she seemed to crave. I caught her watching me out of the corner of her eye, her expression conflicted, uncertain whether I was onto her or simply distracted. One evening, as I walked down the hallway, I heard her on another call. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Yes, he's acting different," she said, her words tinged with suspicion. "It's almost like he knows, but I can't tell for sure." There was a pause, followed by a faint sigh. "Matt, I don't know. I think I just need to go through with it." Her tone was different this time. There was an edge to it, fear, doubt, maybe even regret. I stayed perfectly still, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, listening to every word. She had no idea I was there. The next morning, I spotted a business card sitting on the kitchen counter. It belonged to a local attorney, the logo embossed in shiny gold foil. Emily had left it there, maybe by accident, or perhaps as some sort of test. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. Her name was written neatly in the corner, along with a date: this Thursday. So, it was true. She was making plans to leave. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, the weight of the attorney's card pressing into my palm. Seeing her name and the date in her precise handwriting felt like the final piece of evidence. Emily wasn't hesitating anymore. She was committed. But what she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this battle just as meticulously. Over the last several weeks, I had been methodically laying the groundwork for what I needed to do. All the pieces were in place now: my finances, the house, and most importantly, my determination. The first call I made was to my real estate agent. I had approached her a month ago, keeping my reasoning vague and mentioning that I was thinking about selling the house for business reasons. She hadn't pressed for details back then, and now, when I called to finalize everything, she didn't hesitate. "The buyer's paperwork is complete," she said. "We can close by the end of the week if that works for you." "It does," I replied, keeping my voice steady. The second call was to the bank. I had already moved the majority of our shared funds into a separate account under my name, but this was the final step. "Mr. Carson, would you like to close the joint account today?" the bank representative asked. "Yes. Do it now," I said firmly. As the transactions processed, an odd sense of calm washed over me. Every move I made was deliberate, precise. Emily thought she was in control, but what she didn't realize was that I had been quietly dismantling the foundation of her plans, one step at a time. 2 days later, the movers arrived. The loud beeping of the truck backing into the driveway broke the usual morning quiet, startling Emily out of her routine. She came down the stairs, her hair still damp from the shower, and froze when she saw the movers carrying our furniture out the front door. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp and tinged with panic. I stood in the living room, leaning casually against the doorway. "We're downsizing," I said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. "What are you talking about? Downsizing? Jake, this is our home." "It was," I replied calmly. "The house is sold. Effective tomorrow. The movers are just finishing up the prep work." Her mouth opened and closed, as if she was struggling to form a coherent response. Finally, she managed to sputter, "You can't just sell our house without telling me." "Oh, but I can," I said, keeping my tone measured but firm. "My name is the only one on the deed. Legally, it's entirely my decision." Emily's panic grew as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, and I knew exactly where she was heading, straight for her phone. Before she could get far, I stepped into her path. "Looking for this?" I asked, holding up her phone, which I had quietly grabbed from the kitchen counter earlier. Her glare was sharp, her composure cracking. "What the hell is this, Jake? Are you punishing me for something?" I tilted my head slightly, pretending to be puzzled. "Punishment? No, Emily. This is me taking care of my future, something I should have done a long time ago." She stormed past me, heading into the kitchen. Her movements were frantic as she yanked open drawers and shuffled through papers. I stood back, arms crossed, silently watching. I knew she wouldn't find anything of value. "Where's the money?" she finally shouted, slamming a drawer shut so hard it rattled. "Gone," I said simply. Her face twisted in disbelief. "What do you mean, gone?" "I moved it," I explained, keeping my tone calm. "Everything from the joint account is now in a separate account, in my name." "You can't do that," she screamed, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Oh, but I can." "And I already did," I replied evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. She slumped against the counter, her face pale. For the first time, she looked genuinely defeated. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew all along." I took a step closer, locking eyes with her. "Of course I knew, Emily. I've known for weeks. The receipt, the phone calls, the lawyer's card, you didn't exactly cover your tracks." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. "You really thought I'd sit here, clueless, while you planned to leave me? You underestimated me, Emily. That was your mistake." The sound of the movers finishing up broke the tension. I handed the foreman a tip before walking back into the house. Emily hadn't moved from her spot by the counter, her phone now clutched tightly in her hand as she furiously typed, no doubt messaging Matt. As I passed her on my way out, I paused. "You should call your lawyer," I said over my shoulder. "You're going to need one." I didn't see Emily the next day after the movers finished clearing out the house. She left early that morning, her face hollow, her phone practically glued to her hand. I assumed she was heading straight to Matt, the man she had pinned all her hopes on, the one who was supposed to make her life better. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she sought solace in him, I was finalizing the sale of the house and moving all remaining assets into accounts she couldn't touch. There was nothing left to say to her. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance, Karen. I hadn't expected to hear from her, but her tone made it clear she had something significant to share. "Have you talked to Emily?" Karen asked, her voice cautious, like she was testing the waters. "No," I said flatly. "I assume she's working things out." Karen laughed bitterly. "Working things out? Jake, she's living at her mom's place. Matt dumped her." Her words hit me harder than I expected, hanging in the air like an unexpected blow. For a moment, I felt something, a pang of emotion. Not quite sympathy, but an awareness of just how much Emily had miscalculated her situation. "Matt dumped her?" I repeated, more to confirm than out of shock. Karen hesitated before continuing. "Apparently, he couldn't handle the financial strain. He didn't realize she had, well, nothing. Once he found out, he bailed." I thanked Karen and hung up the phone, my thoughts racing. Emily had gambled everything on Matt, only to end up with less than she'd started with. The realization settled over me, not with satisfaction, but with a strange, quiet finality. The next time I saw Emily was by chance, in the grocery store. She was alone, dressed in an oversized hoodie with her hair pulled back, not for style, but practicality. For a moment, I barely recognized her. When her eyes met mine, her face went pale, and I watched her subtly shift her cart, as though trying to retreat unnoticed. But I wasn't going to let her slip away. "Emily," I said, stepping into her path. Her eyes darted around nervously. "Jake," she replied, her voice flat. A heavy silence fell between us as we stood there, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space. Finally, I decided to break it. "How's your mom?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. Living with her mother must have been a stark contrast to the life Emily used to lead. "She's fine," Emily muttered, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond me. "And Matt?" I asked. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you here, Jake? To gloat?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Emily. I'm here for groceries." I gestured to the few items in my basket. She let out a scoff but didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her purse and mumbled, "I need to go." As she walked away, I couldn't help but notice the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, the slump in her shoulders, the way her eyes avoided meeting anyone else's. She was just a shadow of the vibrant woman I once knew. A month later, Karen called me again. I hadn't expected to hear from her, but her tone told me she had news. "Have you heard about Emily?" Karen asked, her voice blunt and matter-of-fact. "No," I said. "I assume she's managing." Karen let out a dry laugh. "Managing? Jake, she's cleaning houses now. Can you imagine? After how she used to obsess over having everything spotless, it's almost poetic." The words hit me harder than I expected. "She's cleaning houses?" "She's struggling," Karen added bluntly. "I don't think she realized just how hard it would be. But I think she's finally starting to understand what she lost." That evening, I sat by my apartment window, gazing out at the city lights. My thoughts wandered to Emily, the woman who had once laughed so freely on our honeymoon, the one who made me promise never to let work come between us. I wondered if she ever thought about that version of herself, if she regretted losing me as much as I regretted how far apart we drifted. 3 years had passed since Emily walked out of my life, or maybe it was me who walked out of hers. I couldn't be sure anymore. Time had dulled the sharp sting of betrayal, leaving behind a lingering ache, a quiet reminder of everything we had built and eventually destroyed. I hadn't seen her again since that fleeting moment in the grocery store. She looked worn down, like a pale echo of the woman I once knew. Karen, despite my efforts to move on, kept me loosely informed, whether I wanted the updates or not. Emily was scraping by, still living with her mom, trying to make ends meet. Matt, the man she had bet her future on, was long gone, vanishing almost as quickly as he had appeared. I tried not to think about her, pouring my energy into rebuilding my life instead. Then, one day, an envelope appeared in my mail. It was tucked in with the usual pile of bills and letters, plain and unmarked except for my name written in a hand I knew all too well. Cautiously, I opened it, half expecting a jab or some calculated ploy. "We've come full circle. Meet me at the cafe on 4th Street. Noon, Saturday. I'll be waiting." The message was cryptic, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Emily. Saturday arrived faster than I anticipated. I wrestled with whether or not to go, turning over the possibilities in my mind. Was Emily seeking closure? An apology? Did she want forgiveness, or, worse, to ask me to take her back? By the time I stepped through the cafe doors, I had no answers, only a swirl of questions. The small cafe was bathed in sunlight, the quiet hum of conversation and the soft clinking of coffee cups creating a soothing backdrop. I spotted Emily right away. She was seated by the window, her clothes simple, her demeanor subdued. As I approached, her eyes lifted, widening slightly before she gave me a small nod. "Jake," she said softly. "Emily," I replied, sliding into the seat across from her. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "Thank you for coming," she said, skipping over pleasantries and diving straight into what felt like a confession. "I know I don't deserve your time," she began, her voice trembling just enough to betray her emotions, "but I needed to see you. To say I'm sorry." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. The pride and defiance I once knew were nowhere to be found. "For what, Emily?" I asked evenly. "For betraying me? For lying? For assuming the grass was greener on the other side?" She winced at my words but didn't look away. "For all of it," she said. "I was selfish. Blind. I thought I was unhappy, but I didn't realize what I had, what you were." She inhaled deeply, her hands trembling slightly as they cradled her coffee mug. "After everything fell apart, I thought I could start fresh, rebuild. But it didn't take long to see that I wasn't rebuilding anything, I was just tearing myself down further." Her words lingered in the air, carrying the weight of her regret. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, her tone softer now. I wanted you to know that I understand. What I did to you. What I lost." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. A part of me wanted to tell her it was too late, that her apologies couldn't erase the damage done. But another part, a quieter, more understanding part, knew she was being honest. And that sincerity disarmed me. "I appreciate the apology," I said after a pause. "But what do you really want, Emily? Why now?" Her gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment, she seemed unsure. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe closure. Maybe just a chance to tell you I'm not the same person I was back then. And maybe, just to see you again." Her honesty caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what I had expected, some attempt at manipulation, perhaps, or a ploy to regain what she had lost. But this? This felt genuine. As we sat there, I realized something important. The woman across from me wasn't the same Emily who had walked away from our marriage 3 years ago. She had aged, not just in years, but in wisdom, humility etched into the lines of her face. The hardships she had faced had reshaped her. I didn't know if that made a difference. The past couldn't be rewritten, and the scars she had left on me would always be there. But for the first time, I saw the possibility of letting go, not only of her, but of the bitterness and pain I had carried for so long. When I finally stood to leave, Emily looked up at me, her eyes shining with an emotion I couldn't quite place, gratitude, maybe, or hope. "Take care of yourself, Emily," I said. She nodded, her lips curving into a faint, bittersweet smile. You too, Jake. As I stepped out of the cafe, the sun warmed my face, and for the first time in years, I felt unburdened. The weight of the past no longer clung to me. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I was certain of one thing: it was mine to shape, free from the shadows of everything that had been. A few weeks later, another invitation arrived. It was a hand-delivered card, simple and familiar. Emily's handwriting greeted me again, though this time the message was different. One last meeting. Please. I hesitated, staring at the note for longer than I cared to admit. I thought our last conversation had closed that chapter of my life for good. Yet, there was something about this, a pull, an undeniable need to face whatever it was she had left to say. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something more. The cafe on 4th Street looked the same as it always had, though it felt different walking through the door. Once upon a time, this had been our place, filled with laughter and shared dreams. Now, it was just another building, a backdrop to memories I'd long since set aside. The same barista worked behind the counter, and the same gentle jazz played softly in the background. But this time, I wasn't alone. My wife, Amanda, sat across from me, our 3-year-old son perched happily on her lap. His tiny hands smacked at the air as Amanda wiped a bit of milk from his chin. I leaned in, completely absorbed in their little world, until I noticed her. Emily stood at the entrance, frozen in place. Her eyes locked onto us immediately. Her gaze flickered from me to Amanda, and then lingered on my son. Her expression was a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I thought she might turn and walk away, but instead, she stepped inside, clutching a small, worn bag to her chest. Amanda noticed her before I had the chance to speak. "Do you know her?" she asked, her tone calm, more curious than concerned. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice even. "An old friend." I stood and walked toward Emily. Up close, her face gave away everything, the weight of recognition, of realizing just how much time had passed and how far apart our lives had grown. "Emily," I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough for only her to hear. "Jake," she replied, barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the cafe around us fading into the background. Her eyes drifted toward the table where Amanda sat, her expression softening as she watched my son laugh and clap his hands. You have a family now," she said, her voice trembling just enough to reveal the emotion behind her words. "I do," I replied simply, offering no further details. She swallowed hard, nodding as though she had expected this but hadn't been prepared for the reality of it. "She's beautiful. And your son, he's perfect." "Thank you," I said. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything left unsaid. Neither of us seemed willing to fill the void. Finally, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to me. "What's this?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew. "Divorce papers," she said, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. "I never signed them before. I couldn't. But now, I know it's time." I took the envelope, its unexpected weight startling me, not the paper itself, but what it represented. "Emily," I began, but she lifted a hand, shaking her head. "Please, don't," she said quietly. "You don't need to say anything. I had to do this. For both of us." Her eyes flickered back to Amanda and my son. A faint, bittersweet smile crossed her lips. "You found your happiness," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted for you. Even if it wasn't mine to give." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but I managed to keep my composure. "Thank you, Emily," I said sincerely. She nodded, her eyes glistening, and without another word, she turned and walked out of the cafe. I watched her go, the worn bag swinging by her side, her figure disappearing into the bustle of the street outside. That was the last time I saw her. When I returned to the table, Amanda looked at me with gentle curiosity. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, settling into my chair and lifting my son into my arms. "Everything's fine." As his laughter bubbled up, filling the small space between us, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The past was finally behind me, and the future, imperfect, chaotic, and filled with love, was mine to embrace. Sometimes, life doesn't offer second chances, but it does give us opportunities to grow, to heal, and to move forward. Emily had her story to rewrite, and mine was already unfolding, one joyful moment at a time. A few months later, I found myself sitting on a park bench as the early morning sun filtered through the trees, scattering dappled patterns across the ground. The air was crisp, the kind that speaks of beginnings instead of endings. This park had become a place of reflection for me, a space where I could process, find clarity, and finally let go of what had been. 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined feeling this way, unburdened, whole. Back then, I had been consumed by the bitterness of betrayal, weighed down by shattered dreams. Emily's choices had cut deeply, leaving scars I thought I'd carry forever. But life has a way of surprising you. Meeting Amanda wasn't the sweeping, cinematic romance you read about. It was quiet, steady, and inevitable, like the sunrise creeping over the horizon. She brought light into the corners of my heart that Emily had left in shadow. And when our son was born, the broken pieces of my heart rearranged themselves into something stronger, something new. I no longer resented Emily. I couldn't. The past had its place, but it didn't belong in the life I was building. When I saw her at the cafe that final time, she seemed like someone else entirely. The arrogance I had once despised in her was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. Regret clung to her, but so did a sense of purpose. When she handed me the divorce papers, I knew it was more than just a legal step, it was her way of releasing us both from what had been. "Take care of yourself, Emily," I had told her, and I truly meant it. Now, as I sat on the bench and watched the world wake up, I thought about her, not with anger or sorrow, but with a quiet understanding. We were young once, so full of hope, believing love alone could sustain a lifetime. We were wrong, but that didn't make our story worthless. She had her path to walk, and I had mine. A soft breeze stirred the leaves above, and I closed my eyes, letting the moment settle around me. When I opened them, Amanda was walking toward me, our son toddling at her side. His tiny hands reached up for hers, his laughter ringing out like music. "Jake," she called, her voice warm and familiar. I stood to meet them, scooping my son into my arms as his giggles wrapped around me. Amanda smiled, slipping her arm around my waist. "Ready to go home?" she asked. "Always," I said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. As we walked away, leaving the park behind us and stepping into the life we were building, I realized something. Closure didn't mean coming full circle. It meant moving forward. And that's exactly what I was doing, moving forward into a life filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities.